If someone tells another person they are transgender, they are reducing the relationship to a single dimension. It doesn't matter how well-intentioned that communication is or how legitimate the desire to be honest may be. The truth is that at that moment, the entire complexity of the person is overshadowed by a single category, a word, a characteristic that has been excessively stigmatized and misinterpreted by society. Wanting to share that information is legitimate, but so is choosing not to do so immediately. And above all, it is legitimate to question what that urgency to say really means, what social structure imposes it, and whom it serves for that to be the first or only dimension of the conversation. A transgender person is not just their medical history, their transition, or their gender identity. They are a person. They have tastes, history, passions, values, inner conflicts, political ideas, a sense of humor, doubts, insecurities, talents. They have a past, a present, and plans. They have a way of speaking, a way of looking, a laugh. They have childhood memories, cultural references, connections with others. They have a body that lives, not just one that explains itself or defends itself. They have emotions, the ability to love, to think, to create. And yet, if the word transgender is mentioned at the beginning of an emotional connection, all of that disappears. It is erased. A single axis is imposed upon which the other person must decide whether to continue or withdraw, as if the entire personal history could be measured in a single data point. That doesn't happen with other dimensions of people. No one expects someone to reveal on the first date that they have an autoimmune disease. No one demands that someone immediately explain if they take medication for anxiety. No one considers it dishonest if someone doesn't share during the first coffee that they were abused as a child. Because we understand that there are things shared over time, with trust, with context. Things that are built. But transgender people are burdened with a duty of absolute transparency, as if their very existence were an exception that needs justification. As if having a non-normative gender identity, if not disclosed, equals deception. The problem lies in the framework from which the question is asked. When asking whether one should say they are transgender at the beginning of a relationship, the assumption is that this information defines, conditions, or compromises the legitimacy of what follows. And within that assumption, there is violence, even if it is disguised as sincerity. What is expected is not sincerity. It is submission. It is asking someone to lay their entire story on the table so the other person can decide whether to accept it. And that is not symmetrical. That is not equitable. That does not happen in relationships where there is no prejudice. It happens when there is a prior hierarchy that forces one party to justify themselves to the other. Human relationships are not reducible to a category. They are complex dynamics involving affection, desire, affinity, coincidences, differences, contexts. No relationship between two people happens in a vacuum. And no identity should occupy the role of mandatory explanation. Each person has the right to decide when and how to share intimate aspects of their life. Saying that someone is transgender does not have to be the first thing mentioned in an emotional bond. It can be said later. It can be said through words or gestures, or it may not be said at all if not deemed necessary. Because there is no single right way to build trust. And because trust is built on mutual respect, not unilateral demands. Comparing this to other personal differences helps illustrate the point. A person may have strong religious convictions, and that doesn't mean they need to explain them in the first conversation. There may be ideological, class, educational, or national differences. And those differences are discovered, sometimes with surprise, sometimes with difficulty, sometimes with joy. But no one demands that a person reveal everything that sets them apart at the first meeting. It is assumed there is a process. That there is time, that there is mutual exploration. Only when it comes to transgender people is that pact broken. Only then is the entire identity expected to be available from the start. And that is where the political question arises.
Why?
Why is it believed that a trans person must justify their existence from the very first moment? What system sustains that expectation? What model of relationship promotes that idea of total transparency? It is evident that this is not a neutral demand. It reflects a culture that has pathologized, fetishized, and marginalized transgender people. A culture that has decided their bodies must be visible, explainable, classifiable. A culture that still associates transness with lying, deception, disguise. And for that reason, it demands proof, confessions, clarifications. A culture that does not accept the possibility that a person simply is. Saying you are transgender can be a brave decision, but it can also be an unfair burden. Because it forces a person to choose between two risks, saying it and being reduced to a category, or not saying it and being accused of hiding something. And that doesn't happen to other people. No one asks a cisgender woman to clarify that she is cis. No one demands a man confirm his sexual orientation on the first date. But trans people are forced into that dilemma. And either choice can be used against them. That doesn't mean the topic can't be discussed. What is questioned is the demand to say it at a specific moment, as if there were a universal manual defining the exact time to disclose an identity. In reality, what should guide that decision is respect for one's own process. If someone feels comfortable and safe to share their story, they will. And if they need time, they should also be able to take it without being judged. Because personal information is not a debt. It is a right. And as such, it is exercised freely. Those who say that hiding being transgender is a form of deception are replicating a dehumanizing model. Because they begin with the idea that the truth of a person lies in their genitals or medical history. As if what defines someone is their biological past. That view is reductionist and violent. And it is also hypocritical. Because often, those who demand that truth do not share their own. They don't disclose their fears, their traumas, their mistakes. They only want someone else's truth. Not to understand, but to judge. Emotional relationships should not be moral trials. They should be spaces of shared construction, where both parties can open up as they feel trust. Demanding unilateral truth breaks that possibility. It forces one person to expose themselves prematurely, sometimes without knowing if there is respect on the other side. And that is not fair. It is not equitable. It is not healthy. It is understandable for a transgender person to feel insecure or afraid in facing this situation. Because experience shows that acceptance is not always forthcoming. That often what follows a disclosure is rejection. And that is not because the person did anything wrong, but because society remains deeply transphobic. That's why sharing that information must be a choice, not an obligation. A decision based on intuition, on reading the context, on the ability to perceive whether there is openness from the other side. It is also important to recognize that many people feel offended when they are not told immediately. And that offense is disguised as violated rights, unmet expectations, moral arguments. But deep down, it is discomfort with difference. An inability to accept that there are lives that don't follow the same script. And that is the problem of the person who cannot accept it, not of the one who decides when to share their story. Analogies with other situations help expose the arbitrariness. A person may have a criminal record and not be required to disclose it on the first date. They may have been married. They may have children. They may have had traumatic experiences they are not ready to share. And that is respected. But if it's a trans person, it is not respected. They are expected to reveal everything. As if not saying it were a betrayal. There is a turning point in this whole discussion. The right to be complex. Trans people have the right to be complex. To not be reduced to one aspect. To be seen in their entirety. And that means being able to decide when, how, and with whom to share their story. It means not every relationship is a test. Not every interaction must pass through a classification filter. There are nuances, timing, paths. Not everything must be said at the beginning. Because authentic relationships are built in layers, with steps, with shared moments. If someone reacts badly upon learning the other person is trans, what they're really saying is they didn't value them for who they were, but for an expectation. And that is not love. It is not genuine desire. It is projection. And the problem isn't having said it too late. The problem is that there was never real interest. Only an illusion of normality. And when that illusion breaks, rejection appears. But that break is not the responsibility of the one sharing their truth. It is the responsibility of the one who cannot sustain the bond beyond a category. There is also a matter of dignity in all of this. It's not just about strategies to avoid rejection. It's about asserting oneself as a subject, about not yielding to the logic that demands explanations, about not validating the discourse that says there's something to hide. Trans identity is not an uncomfortable truth. It is a legitimate reality. And as such, it must be lived freely, without answering to anyone. No one can be forced to share what they are not ready to say, especially when what is being demanded has no other purpose than to classify, exclude, or confirm prejudice. If a trans person chooses not to say it up front, they are not lying. They are protecting themselves. They are observing. They are choosing when to trust. And that is part of their right. No one has the right to demand that information without a foundation of respect. And if there is no respect, then it is better that there be no relationship. In a society where trans people are still discriminated against, violated, and excluded, expecting them to always be the ones to expose themselves first is yet another form of violence. It shifts the burden of proof. It asks the victim to anticipate harm, to prevent rejection, to prepare the ground. But that is not fair. It is a trap. Because if they say it, they may be rejected. And if they don't say it, they may be accused of lying. The problem is not what the trans person does. The problem is the system that puts them in that impossible position. Emotional relationships must be built on desire, curiosity, and openness, not on control, suspicion, or judgment. And that means accepting that some things are discovered over time, that not everything must be said at the start, that trust is earned, that respect is demonstrated, and that no one has the right to reduce another person to a single word. Being transgender is not a flaw. It is not an anomaly. It is not an uncomfortable truth. It is just one more way of being human. And like all ways of being human, it deserves to be lived freely, with dignity, with the right to complexity. Whoever cannot accept that is not ready for a real relationship. Because real relationships mean accepting the other in their entirety. Not only in what confirms our expectations, but also in what challenges them. That is why the answer to the question of whether one should say it up front is simple. There is no single answer. Each person decides. Each relationship is different. What matters is that the decision be free, not imposed. That there be respect. That there be a possibility to build without fear. That identity is not a condemnation, but simply another part of the shared journey.